All right, why don't we get going on the Making Infill Pencil Suburban Corridors workshop. Thanks for coming today, and thanks for you those that are participating online. This session is going to be recorded and posted on the SACOG website for anybody who's not able to make it. So today we're going to have David Garcia from the Turner Center at UC Berkeley talk about just some of the development economics that go into it and what local jurisdictions can do. Infill is increasingly important to us with the blueprint and our MTP, Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We're calling for a lot of infill. Your local plans also include a lot of infill, but we've been hearing from both staff level and our elected officials in the region that making infill is challenging. So David's going to focus today on what local jurisdictions can do to make that happen. So a little bit about David. He is the policy manager at the UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. He leads the center's engagement in local, state, and federal housing policy and supports the generation of research-driven policies, ideas, and proposals and papers. So with that, David Garcia.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks everyone for being here today. I think some of you were at the Civic Lab presentation, so rest assured this presentation is not just the same one. We have kind of rearranged it and reran some of the analysis, so what you're seeing here is original. But let me just give a little bit of background as to how we got to join with SACOG to do this specific work. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Turner Center, we are a housing research and policy organization that lives at UC Berkeley, both within the College of Environmental Design and the Haas School of Business. So we are UC Berkeley. And so our goal is to really create research and policy recommendations that can actually be enacted and have an impact on the housing crisis today. So our goal is always to be not just putting out ideas for the sake of putting out ideas, but finding places for them in the actual conversation today, many times here in Sacramento. So part of that work has revolved around really unpacking how decisions on development get made. What is the process that developers go through to decide whether or not they're going to build a project, and what does that project need to be in order to satisfy their bank, their investors, and themselves ultimately. So we started this work about a year and a half ago through the Metropolitan Planning Commission's CASA process, where we provided some technical support unpacking what a typical development project looks like in Oakland, and we've since expanded that to San Jose, and now to Sacramento, thanks to our partnership with SACOG. So I'm going to walk through the results of that analysis today. This is our mission statement. I kind of already went over it. And I also went over this. So really quickly, the goals for today are twofold. The first is to describe the cost and the financing requirements that go into specifically suburban infill developments. I know SACOG has been very focused on trying to catalyze development along the region's key commercial corridors. And so that's what we've tried to focus on here. So I'm going to walk through what a project like this might look like, what are the characteristics and development assumptions on an average project like this. From there, we're going to unpack how a developer will then try to obtain financing. What are the minimum requirements that a developer needs to hit in order for them to get money to even build this project? And then lastly, we're going to look at how the decisions we make as policymakers impact this math that the developers have to go through to decide whether or not they're going to build something or not. So to start, we put together a project prototype to help us answer these questions. And so what you see here on the right is a rendering of a project in Roseville, which is about what we've modeled for our pro forma. So it's a market rate building. It's about 4 stories. And so this means that it's not subsidized by any affordable housing programs or low-income housing tax credits. It's a pure market-driven development. And also, I should note that this is a rental project. This is not a for-sale project. The numbers would be slightly different if it was a for-sale project. We have 2 acres of land, which in a more dense urban infill environment, that would be hard to come by, but in a lot of these commercial corridors, some of that amount of land is possible. And we modeled that this project would be about 42 units per acre, which for some of you is probably going to be pretty dense. For others, it might be pretty reasonable. But for just the purposes of this discussion, we went with this unit size. We also assumed that we would have 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit, so a 2-to-1 ratio. And then most importantly, this is what we call a Type 5 construction, which is wood frame, which is the most cost-effective form to build this kind of product. It means that we don't have concrete podiums where the cars park at parking's at grade. It's much cheaper to build this way, and particularly for this region, probably the best way to try and get more infill density. So after we designed the project, we had to make a series of assumptions, and you can see those here. So the first assumption is that our site is clean, in that we don't need to demolish anything, there's no environmental remediation necessary, and we don't have any significant off-site infrastructure improvements. Now, to be fair, in an infill location, this is very rare. In many cases, you will have old gas tanks that you need to remediate underneath the surface. You will have to bring in new infrastructure to serve a project, and there generally is some demolition involved. So all of these can increase your costs, but again, for the sake of just describing the development process, we've assumed that we just don't have that in our very fortunate infill site. A couple of other assumptions we've made is that we have standard approval times. It takes about a year to a year and a half to get approvals for our prototype. Another very key variable is that we have assumed $20,000 in fees per unit. As you all know, this varies widely depending on the city you're in, and in many cases, your overall stack of fees are not entirely in the control of your jurisdiction. You have school fees, you have utility fees, and whatnot. But we have assumed that we have about $20,000 in fees charged by the city where this prototype is taking place. So that's in addition to school fees and other fees. And then also importantly, we've assumed Q4 2018 construction costs. And this is important because this doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but in the construction industry, we're experiencing increases in costs from 1% to 2% per month. So the numbers you're about to see are probably already out of date. Now that we know what our assumptions are, what the project looks like, we can run what the costs are going to be. And so we anticipated that to build this prototype, it would cost us about $24.5 million. And this is based on conversations we have had with several development companies, general contractors, architects who all have knowledge building here in the region. And I'll walk through what all these costs are now. So you can see that the bulk of our cost is made up of the hard costs, the 73% you see here in the middle. This refers to the cost for labor and materials. And this is not unique to the Sacramento area. We have seen this bulk of cost vary from 2/3 to 70% of the overall cost. Here it's a little bit higher. But also a significant cost driver is the stack of soft costs you see here, that 21% at the top. These are all the costs that go into making the project work on paper. So this is the money you pay to your architects, your engineers, any other third-party professional service that you have to use to get this project to work on paper. There are any number of consultants that a developer has to use, from consultants to tell you if your property is historic or not, consultants to tell you what the shadows are going to be from your project, attorney's fees, going through any sort of environmental impact report. That is all a part of what goes into this cost. We also have financing costs. So these are costs that are incurred as a cost to close financing as well, and this is a very important part, as well as a developer fee. And so the developer fee is about 3% of the total cost of the project. That goes directly to the developer to help pay for their overhead for the project. So this is for paying for their time to be at the planning counter, paying for their staff time to work on the project itself. It is not meant to be any sort of profit. It's just to pay them back, to make them whole, because the process itself could take 3 to 5 years. And in many cases, that's a good scenario. And then we also have a category here for fees, which I walked through earlier, again, $20,000 per unit. And at the bottom, we have land cost. Now, this is a big variable, too. When we've done this work in the Bay Area, that number doubles as far as a percentage of total cost. That could be 10 to 15% here. We've looked at comps in suburban areas, and the land is actually relatively inexpensive in comparison to the rest of the project. So now that we've walked through at a high level what the project characteristics are and what the project looks like, we have to think about how we're going to pay for the project. And the way I like to explain it is that it's not much different than the way we would go about purchasing a home. We would get a sizable chunk of the money to pay for that home through debt. So in the case of a home buyer, a mortgage from a bank, or in the case of a real estate developer, a loan from a major financial institution. But they don't pay for the whole cost of that project. So just like in a home that you're purchasing, you have to come in with a certain amount of money, you have to come in with equity. And in our case, as a real estate developer, we get that equity from private investment groups, from pension funds, all sorts of categories of financing that could really invest in anything they want. And so there is a bit of a pressure on developers to prove that their investment is worthwhile, because it does come with a lot more risk than, say, putting money into stocks or bonds, or even things like commercial real estate, which is a little bit safer. And so both debt and equity have a certain set of threshold requirements that a developer needs to demonstrate in order for them to even consider giving funding to a project. And so I'm going to walk through those assumptions now. And so the first thing I'm going to walk through is what the, I don't need to print this.
Connection to printer.
All right, so if anyone needs printout copies, we won't be able to help you. So a bank is going to need us to show that the amount of income we're going to get on the project surpasses the amount of debt we're going to take on the project. And they measure this through something called a debt service coverage ratio, which basically means if the amount of income I'm bringing into the project is just enough to pay off my debt, they're not going to lend to me because they consider that too risky. And that's what you see on the left-hand side. So I need to demonstrate that my income is an order of magnitude above what they're going to loan to me in order for them to mitigate the risk of me not paying that loan back. So for example, if my net operating income is less than I had projected, I will be in danger of not actually paying off my loan. Or if my operating expenses are higher, just something that I had assumed was wrong. So they build in that buffer to protect themselves against default. And that's, again, a debt service coverage ratio. And here we've assumed that we need to have 1.3 times the amount of income to the amount of debt we're going to be issued. I mentioned this earlier in my kind of analogy to buying a home, but just to reiterate here, the bank is not going to give us all of the money we need to build this project. They're only going to give us a certain amount, and this is known as a loan to cost. And here we projected that we can get about a 65% loan to cost, which means that we can get a sizable chunk of money from the bank to build this project. That being said, we're still $8.5 million in the hole, and we have to go find that money from somewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, that money comes from equity sources. Let's go through here. Okay. So in order for the project to hit the threshold requirements of what the equity partners need, I need to charge a certain amount of money to make that back. So that is illustrated here in the rents that I have projected in this project. So this project would need to achieve, or would achieve these rents based on kind of the market comps we saw. And again, for some of your jurisdictions, this might be right on target, it might be a little low. For others, it might be actually quite high. But again, for the sake of simplicity, we use these numbers here. And going back to the piece on what our equity investors need to be comfortable, there are a lot of different ways to measure a return requirement. And we can spend some time in question and answer going through what those are. But for our purposes, I'm going to walk you through something called a return on cost, which is basically the return I get based on the cost it takes me to build this project. And in the Sacramento area, from our conversations with lenders and professionals in the region, we need to get at least a 6% return on cost in order for a project to even get any interest, let alone actually closing the deal. And so based on these rents and based on the cost of the project, which I walked through, this is where this project stacks up. It only gets a 5% return on cost. It's far below what we need, which is 6%. And so probably this project does not, as I've laid it out here, is not going to get financing. There's no lender, there's no equity partner that will be comfortable enough at this level to lend on this project. So the good news is the way I've laid out the project, that's not necessarily exactly how the project has to be based on the tools we have available to us to help get this project closer to that 6% to feasibility. So I'm going to walk through what some of those tools are, and then we can talk a little bit more specifically about how realistic are these tools. So the first tool that I like to bring up is the fact that you'll remember we had a 2-to-1 parking ratio at the start of this presentation for this project. And that parking is not free. That is a cost to the developer that has to be subsidized by the income of the project. So to the extent that we can lower our parking requirements, that actually helps the project become more feasible. So you can see here, it doesn't get us all the way to project feasibility, but it does get us a lot closer if we lower our parking requirements to just 1 spot per unit. You'll recall I also made an assumption of $20,000 per unit in fees. If we were to reduce fees for this particular project, say to $5,000 per unit, just for the fees that are charged by the city, we get closer to feasibility as well. Still not all the way there. And so we also looked at how expediting reviews can help get us there as well. And so it adds a little bit of value, and it adds it in the time savings that we get from an expedited review, because we avoid construction cost increases, and we also do not have to hold the property as long, so we don't have to incur holding costs such as property taxes, maintenance, things like that. But we're still not quite there. So the last thing we layered on to get this prototype to feasibility was to increase the density slightly. You'll remember we started at about 40 units per acre. If we kick that up to 50 units per acre, or 52 units to be exact, then this project starts to look like one that we could maybe take and get financing. Now, important point, that 6% is really a bare minimum. In many cases, you may need to get higher than that. And depending on the project and the equity partner, this might be attractive, it might not. But at least we're in the ballpark and we're having that conversation. So all of this, again, is to show you that there's a big chunk of the development cost stack that local governments really don't have control over. That's controlled by a broader market, the market for lumber, labor, things like that. But there are tools that we have at our disposal that can make a significant impact in whether or not we actually see this type of housing built in our community. So just to recap what I went through, again, expedited reviews are really key, not just because of the cost savings that I laid out here, but also because it signals to a developer that that you can have a certain level of certainty of what the project is going to be subject to. You can take that level of certainty to your equity partners, and they may be more comfortable as well if they know that they have an expedited review process and they don't have to go through too many discretionary reviews. Again, lowering impact fees. It's easy for me to show how that impacts, but the feasibility of the project. But it's also a question of priorities as well, because cities use these fees to pay for really important infrastructure. And so to the extent that we can balance the need for this infrastructure with the need to get housing to pencil out, I think that's a really important conversation to have. And in our research and conversations with cities and developers, I think a lot of times we just talk past each other about, well, I need lower fees, but I need to pay for this. Is there a mechanism that we can come up with that allows us to help plan for and pay for the impacts of these projects, but without stopping the projects altogether? Also, zoning for density, really important. In a lot of cases, we may need a project to be slightly more dense than what is allowed on the books in order for it to work. And so in these cases, if we can do that planning work up front, you can avoid a developer having to go through the variance process or getting a general plan amendment or something like that. That helps with time, and it also helps with certainty. And then lastly, where it makes sense, reducing parking requirements is really key, particularly around key corridors and areas where we think we can leverage existing transportation assets, because again, parking costs developers money. It doesn't actually make them any money. So to the extent we can help balance that out, it is really key too. And I made this point earlier at the SACOG board meeting. All of this stuff doesn't need to be done piecemeal. To the extent that we can do this in one comprehensive plan, say a specific plan or an overlay, where you set the fees, you do the CEQA work up front, we've seen that be really effective in a lot of places, because again, it provides a level of certainty, it provides streamlining, and it really signals to the development community that you are really focused on getting these projects to work, and you've done the upfront planning work to make it happen. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to go in depth in any or all of these points, but I really wanted to open it up to you and then see what questions you have and really talk through the presentation here. I know I went over it at a pretty high level, so if we want to drill down into any of these issues or topics, I'm happy to do so.
Okay. Questions from the live audience first.
We've seen that in cases, and also it depends on one's definition of suburban location. So, for example, the picture I showed you was of Roseville, which, depending on your point of view, may or may not be suburban. But there are certainly communities outside of the urban core, outside of Midtown and West Sac, where you are seeing projects like that work. And so that was just one example of Roseville. There are a couple other examples. I know Folsom has done a little bit, but there is some of that working today. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's widespread, but I think there has been some proofs of concept out there. Yeah. So it is not, so it rises with the number of units. So I would add, I think my number was almost $300,000 a unit or something like that. So every unit I would add, I would also add cost to that. Yeah, that's a really good point. So once you go over, it really depends. If you go over 5 stories, you need to construct a concrete podium to go another story or 2 up. And then once you go above 7 or 8 stories, or I should say once you get to 7 or 8 stories, then you're talking about concrete and steel, which can be incredibly expensive, and that's why you only see that kind of construction in really, really dense urban areas.
So how many stories was, when you changed the density, did it increase the stories, or are you able to make up for that because you have less parking?
Yeah, so I was able to make up for that just on the existing acreage with the parking. So we didn't have to go up another story. We didn't have to introduce concrete into the equation at all. It's just a little bit more wood framing. And so the cost per unit didn't change because the type of building didn't change either. And reducing the parking helps with that a lot because the parking's at grade. And so the less space I have to dedicate to just asphalt, the more I can dedicate to the apartment complex, which brings in more income and revenue. Should I call on people or
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
But I will need to interrupt before that.
At least $40 per year.
Mm-hmm. When you say 40,000, are you talking about total fees or just fees coming from the city itself? Yeah, and I tried to caveat that as much as I could. Is we've done a lot of work on fees, and they vary widely, from city limit to city limit, and so that's a big variable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
just to repeat the question,
sure.
real quick for the online audience, is where'd you get the data for the $20,000 fee?
So that was informed by a little bit of our work. So we've looked in our previous research that was independent of this, but it looked at impact fees. We looked at Sacramento and Roseville. In Sacramento, the fees, when we examined them, were actually on the lower end, at least the ones charged just by the city, and then Roseville was a bit higher, so we took something in the middle, knowing full well that depending on what city you're in, could be completely different. Yes. Did your fees estimate include water and sewer? It's a good question.
Do they include water and sewer is the question.
So the estimate that I included in the $20,000 stack was not water and utilities. So we estimated that separately because, generally speaking, a lot of times that's a different utility district that's not within the jurisdiction of the city. So was that in soft cost? Yeah, that would have been in the soft cost stack, yeah.
For those of you online, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we do have a number of them, but go ahead.
Many times we get asked by developers if any way they can finance the fees.
Mm-hmm.
How significant of an impact do you think that would actually?
That's a good question.
So can fees be financed? Jurisdictions are being asked that question by developers. Can that work?
Yeah, I've seen that happen, and I've also seen cities defer fees. And so the fee amount doesn't necessarily change, but it helps you get to closing so that you can push out the payment of those fees once you actually start collecting revenue to the project. So it helps. It helps kind of in an administrative sense. It makes it easier for the developer to absorb the fees so they can pay them out after they've closed. Or once they've actually started getting income on the project, versus having to take that out of their capital up front, when they put shovels in the ground. So it helps if there's a construction delay, they don't have to carry that cost as well.
Getting developers to approve the affordable unit card like that,
Mm-hmm.
add them on to
Mm-hmm.
So the question.
So what we're talking about is even greater density than 40. I've worked in Placer County for many years, so I understand their line of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting up in 50 or 60 just because of the price of the land and the cost of construction, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
The only way we can get projects.
The only way to get projects potential is to increase densities, particularly with the affordable requirements. Comments on that?
Yeah, so that's a really great point, and one that I didn't explicitly address here, but in previous presentations I've talked about the need to balance, say, the policy goal of the city to get affordability included. What offsets does the city provide to help absorb those costs? And a lot of cities will just look at, well, there's a state density bonus, use that or don't. But our research shows that outside of big cities, the density bonus doesn't work anywhere. No one's using it. So what we've seen some cities do is, you can go above and beyond what the state density bonus says. And so they've, in some instances, the city of Santa Rosa has doubled their density bonus. And because for that exact point, even with an increase in density, the added affordability may make a project still not pencil effectively. So I think it's really important for cities to examine what works well for them, because I think it should be a policy goal to encourage affordability. All the literature tells us that mixed income communities are really positive. So to the extent that we can calibrate a density bonus locally that gets us the density we need, but also the affordability we need that still makes projects work, I think that's a really key thing to do. The thing is a lot of cities either, can't do that work, or a lot of times that's a political process, and the number of inclusionary is more of a contentious piece when it really should be informed by what can actually work in that city.
Microunits,
Mm-hmm.
apartments that are very small, really.
Mm-hmm.
Is that happening in the Bay Area? Is it successful? Is it not successful? I think we kind of have this suburban mentality where somebody has to have,
Mm-hmm.
people need 1,000 square feet or it's way too small.
Yeah.
So,
The question is microunits work?
So that's a really good question, and I didn't go through the unit mix here, or I think I did. But you'll notice we focused mostly on studios and 1-bedrooms, and we had some 2-bedrooms. And that's from the market analysis that we were able to pull for the area, is that a lot of apartments, they are not 1,000 square feet, or they're actually pretty small because there is actually a decent amount of demand for that. It's just no one has been building that product for a long time. So that is something that we've seen more of in the Bay Area. These micro units that are 300 square feet even, they're really small. I wouldn't say it's the norm. One of the issues is most cities will structure their fees on a per unit basis, and so they are disincentivized from building, developers are disincentivized from building smaller units because they have to pay the fee more. So we always try to look at, is there a way to restructure fees so that's not on, so it's on a square footage basis versus a per unit basis, so that you're letting the market kind of decide what units should be built versus a developer switching to 2- and 3-bedrooms because they don't, have to pay the fee as much instead of doing studios and 1-bedrooms, even if the market supports that. Yes.
Do you see the trend happening more, is the question?
I do, absolutely, yes.
Okay, why don't we have a number of online questions, but we could scatter them between live person questions as well. So first question is, if suburban apartment projects at 42 dwelling units to the acre don't currently work, then how will anything get built in our region when most of the suburban jurisdictions have zoning that allows for only 30 units?
So I would answer that in 2 ways. The first is we looked at this on 2 acres. If we had more land, we could build more units, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be more dense, right? So, and a lot of the projects we are seeing in suburban locations, they're not on 2 acres, they're on 5 acres. So so they don't necessarily have to increase their density to increase the number of units that they include on the site. The second thing I would say is, perhaps we should see where it's appropriate to be zoning slightly more dense to get to 40 units or whatever the number is that works in your community. Because we heard earlier, the density bonus is not necessarily attractive even with that increase. So I think there is some opportunities here. There's certainly talk about this at the state legislature about where are the appropriate units. And 40 units per acre is 3 to 4 stories tops. So and again, that's on a smaller footprint. So we can do 2 things. We can get larger plots of land, but we can also go up to maybe 4 stories. That can allow us to get that level of density. In some communities, that may be a bit of a stretch for what you've seen being built now, but I think it's something to consider.
When did we get into?
Yeah. So we have 2 questions from the phone audience. First is, how does that work when city attorneys are increasing, stating that fees such as impact fees cannot be deferred?
I don't know that I would have to get more specificity on that, because my understanding is that cities have the authority to defer or finance fees. If that's not the case, and I'd love to learn more about that, but it's my understanding that cities kind of have broad authority on how they would want to administer their fee programs.
Okay. Second question is, reduced parking standards in suburban areas in practice has created off-site parking problems with adjacent neighborhoods or uses. How have suburban communities addressed this successfully?
That's a really good question. I think what I have heard from builders is that they are not seeing as many tenants actually come in with cars. So I don't know if this is, if the question is coming from a really recent example, or perhaps before we had things like Uber and Lyft. But a lot of individuals, particularly younger individuals, are not buying cars anymore, and they simply don't have them. And so developers are becoming more comfortable building projects that simply don't have higher levels of parking. That being said, there is a bit of a tension between what developers think they can get from the market and what their banks want them to see. Because the banks oftentimes will say, you need more parking, otherwise we can't give you the money because we don't think you're going to lease your project because we think the same way. We think everyone has two cars. So this is a constant tension we're seeing, not just between cities and developers, but developers and their finance partners too. So I think that's a really good point. I don't know that a lot of cities have come up with a good way to do this. To the extent that there's an issue of tenants saying, I don't have parking on site, so I'll just park on the street. Some cities have instituted, say, residential zoning permits, and they may not allow, say, a new apartment project to have their residents get those permits so they couldn't park off-site. So as a way to help with enforcement. So that's one way I have seen it mitigated.
Okay, I'm wondering if I can go a little bit deeper on the affordability question.
Sure.
So we talked a little bit about, a mixed income project, potentially one that's 20% affordable.
Mm-hmm.
What about a 100% affordable project? How does that impact the calculus here?
Mm-hmm.
Is that changing any of the costs? And then obviously it's changing the financing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that loud enough?
That's good.
Okay. So what I walked everyone through was a market rate project, which the financing structure is relatively straightforward. Again, I just need a loan and I need equity, and that's it. If I am building a deed-restricted affordable project, the market doesn't work for that, so I need a significant amount of subsidy to make that work, and there are several places where I have to go get that subsidy. So primarily, there's the low-income housing tax credit program that I will get the bulk of my money for, but that doesn't cover the whole cost for affordable housing. So I have to get money from a city, maybe home funds or CDBG funds, or if I'm lucky enough to be in a city that has a housing bond pass, they may have some funds there too. But then I may also need to supplement that with a state program, like the multifamily housing program or the affordable housing sustainable communities program. We have a really good chart. I don't have it here, but it shows you what the capital stack is for an affordable housing project. And whereas in market rate projects, you get it from 2 places, for affordable projects, you can get it from 10, 15 places. And so that makes putting together deals for affordable housing incredibly complex, because if you have 10 sources of financing, they have 10 different sets of requirements that I have to hit as a developer. So it's really a challenge to meet. On the cost front, generally speaking, affordable housing costs slightly more to build than market rate housing, mostly because of all of these costs that are associated with getting tax credits and all these other sources of financing. But also tax credits have very specific requirements for what you build with their money, and those can increase the cost to build that project too. There's also a limited number of general contractors and subcontractors and architects who work specifically on affordable housing. So the pool of professionals you have to pull from to design this project is limited, and that drives the cost up too.
Fair to say that all the policy interventions that you talked about today help both a market rate and affordable projects?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've seen examples of this even in the region. So the city of Sacramento has waived, to a certain extent, some fees for specifically affordable housing. And so the affordable housing builders that I know, they have a really tough time with fees, and many times they will have to negotiate things like school fees on an entirely senior housing project. So schools don't necessarily give you a waiver for that. You have to actually talk through and negotiate bringing that down. So for affordable development specifically, it's very very helpful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So right now, there's a discussion on the one side or
That's a good question. So for the folks on the phone, the question was, how have cities structured their inclusionary ordinances? Is it done on like a project by project basis? How do they do that? I think that's a really great question. Some cities, cities don't do it on a project by project basis unless it's a subject of like negotiations through a development agreement, where the city and the developer negotiate on what percentage of affordability they want. So in that case, it is done on a project-by-project basis, and you would assume that in these conversations, the developer would say, I can't handle more than 12% or whatever that number is, and the city can negotiate that. For specific ordinances, that's much more difficult because you're trying to predict what the market's going to do in the future. And we've seen ordinances that have been passed and in a year become obsolete because construction costs have become so high that projects can maybe no longer absorb that level of inclusionary that they could even a year prior. So what some cities have done is they've done a couple things. They will sometimes phase in an inclusionary requirement or a fee requirement where the in lieu fees of the requirements are very low to start, to give the market time to adjust, to let land prices adjust, and so there's not a shock to the system. The city of Oakland did this with their most recent fee update, where and they also did it by city zone, where over the course of 3 or 4 years, the fees and the requirements step up over time. But really, what works best is just trying to take that number or that fee number out of the political discussion and into a discussion of does this work economically. So the city of San Diego actually just put forth an update to their inclusionary ordinance because people were really concerned that the in lieu fee was too low and the developers were just feeing out every time. And the policy goal was, hey, we want some of these units built on site. And so some of the stakeholders wanted to basically not let builders fee out and just make them basically require them to put more affordability on site. But the staff did an economic analysis that showed that if we were to do that, we would actually probably choke off development to a certain extent. And the better mechanism would be just to make that fee higher to give a developer more of a choice of, okay, now the fee is really high, does it make more sense for me to put it on site? And they coupled that with changes in their density bonus law as well, so that they also, if they put their units on site, they could also take advantage of more density. So my recommendation would be to kind of look at all of these different things comprehensively and say, if affordability on site is our goal, how do we create some offsets to entice developers to do that, rather than just say, well, it's a 15% requirement and you just have to do it. One thing I will note is that AB 1505 from a couple years ago, which was the Palmer fix that basically allowed cities to restart their inclusionary requirements on rental projects, they require cities to provide an alternative way to adhere to inclusionary zoning ordinances. So you have to provide an in lieu fee option or land dedication or something like that. So cities are not allowed to basically just require them to be on site without offering another way to adhere to that policy.
A couple more online questions. If upzoning to densities of 50 acre is not politically feasible, are there other development types besides single-family homes that are financially feasible and can address either the needs of missing middle or
That's a really great point. So what I've walked through for many jurisdictions is a pretty dense project, but density doesn't have to necessarily look like that. We talk a lot about this concept of missing middle housing, both from the perspective of the building typology itself, but also missing middle in terms of who can afford this. And so these are things like townhomes, small lot houses, maybe duplexes or triplexes and things like that. These are even more inexpensive to build than the project I walked you through. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but things like townhomes, they don't require elevators, everything's at grade. They're the most efficient form of housing to build. The problem is, in many places where we have zoned for density, we've zoned it to where we want more 5, 6-story buildings or 4-story buildings, and then everything else is single family. So we are really limiting ourselves to where we can actually build this missing middle type of housing, and this has been a point of discussion throughout the legislative session: is how do we build densely around transit hubs, but also increase density in some of these single family areas where things like an accessory dwelling unit or a duplex aren't going to fundamentally change the character of the neighborhood, but will provide meaningful increase in density. So I think that's a really important thing to talk about because there's good opportunity there, both to rethink our zoning, but also from an economic standpoint, building these products is way more cost effective than building even the type of housing I walked you through now. Again, townhomes, duplexes, they're cheaper to build and they're more likely to be affordable to individuals at lower levels of the income spectrum.
Has the Turner Center done any sort of feasibility or prototype analysis similar to what you've done here, but for something like a fourplex replacing a single-family home?
So we haven't done that. Unfortunately, I want to do that, and I'm pushing the research team to go in that direction because I think we get stuck in this this tension between building really densely and building single-family homes in the fit. And there needs to be some research on what is the potential, both from a zoning perspective, but just economically, to build kind of gentle density, these 2-3 unit projects. So if you would like to write to my boss about how important that research would be, I would appreciate that.
Like one more from
So I have another question from the phone audience.
Mm-hmm.
How do you discourage land banking in urban areas where property is zoned for higher density and close to urban amenities, but due to speculation, the property is being held vacant to sell later on?
I would tax the land better, but that gets into Prop 13, and I don't know if we want to go there. So this is a question that's been asked in the Bay Area because there's a lot of that, not necessarily just vacant land, but just underutilized land, like parking lots. And so the city of Oakland actually passed a policy where they're going to tax vacant land or vacant units a much higher amount than they are charged currently. And that's really meant to help push people towards not speculating and to actually building things. But absent that kind of reform, it's really hard to do that because we may have a very valuable piece of land, but because of our tax structure, it's taxed at a very low rate. And so that person doesn't have an incentive to do anything with it or to sell it because of our, they pay probably next to nothing in taxes. So that is my answer. It is not easy to implement, but in the long run, that's probably the solution.
The next online question is, as planners, we've been told that multifamily developers need a 10% return on investment, use a 6% return on cost, I believe.
Yeah.
How do they differ, and what's that all?
That's a good question. So return on investment can be measured a bunch of different ways. And the difference between, say, the return on cost that I showed you and the return on investment is really, the return on investment is a return on the money that myself as an equity investor puts into the project, whereas a return on cost is a return on the total cost of the project. So that's why it's lower. And a lot of groups will use something like an internal rate of return, which is a way to estimate the return I'll get from, let's say, 10 years of income from the project and then selling the project. So it makes the return look bigger. That's why developers like to use it and equity partners like to use it. So this project had, I think, like a 16% internal rate of return, which for some groups is not going to fly. They want something in the 20%. For other groups, they may be okay with that. So I guess the whole point of it is there's a bunch of different ways to measure return. And as a developer goes through the pre-development process, they'll have to show all of these different metrics to their bank, to their equity partners to do that. So they don't just rely on the return on cost metric. That's really the first line numbers that they'll put together to decide whether or not to move forward. And once they do that, then they'll do more sophisticated return numbers.
Before I go on to more, any other live question, audience, before I continue on the list of questions we got online?
It's easy, right? Everyone's just going to be a developer.
There we go. Are 100% affordable projects more feasible because of other available funding sources, such as tax credits, federal and state funding programs like HP, despite the likelihood of triggering prevailing wages from local or state funding?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it really depends on where you are. If you're in a market like a lot of suburban communities where the market rates are not as high as urban areas, affordable projects are probably going to be more feasible than market rate projects. That being said, it's really difficult to get that money, and you have to get it from 10 different places, like I mentioned earlier. So it might be more feasible in that it is more likely to happen than a market rate project. That doesn't mean that it's easy to build, because the low-income housing tax credits are competitive. The state programs, in many cases, they are competitive and there's a lot of builders competing for those dollars. And so in some respect, it's getting easier because the state has committed new dollars to affordable housing through Prop 1, through Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, and a lot of communities have had bonds to help support this stuff. So there is more money than there has been in a very long time. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's easier or more feasible, because that money still is dwarfed by the amount we truly need if we really wanted to subsidize all the affordable housing we needed.
Related tag-on question to that one was, what about an 80% market rate and 20% affordable project? Is that more financially feasible than a market rate or less?
So it depends on how it's structured. If we're talking about doing 80% market and 20% affordable but with no subsidies, it really depends on whether or not the market can support that. So if I'm in San Francisco, an 80-20 project probably works, because the rents on the market side are so astronomically high that it helps support those 20% of units that are held at affordable. If I'm looking at a market that's not as crazy as the Bay Area, 20% is kind of hard to absorb. So for example, I think there might be someone here from Davis. I think you had a 30% inclusionary requirement, right? And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they reduced it to 10, or they took it off the table, or? Yeah. Yeah, and so, again, it really depends on the market. Now, to the extent that you have really experienced developers that kind of do both market rate and affordable, that's where those projects have become more feasible, because if you have the experience and sophistication of work with tax credit system, you can get credits to help pay for that 20% and then use the market to build that other 80%. There's as many groups who do that, unfortunately. But if you have the savvy and the staff to do that, it works.
Next question related is, with the additional funding sources available for affordable development, can low-income apartment development be done at less density, such as 30 to 40 units, compared with market?
Yeah, I believe they can. So the majority of affordable housing projects we see are not super dense, and again, that depends on what your definition of density is. But in the research we've done on the cost of affordable housing projects, a lot of the projects that are most cost-effective are the ones in the valley that are more walk-up apartments. They don't have elevators. They're not quite as dense. So you don't necessarily need to be dense, but a lot of times you need to have a lot of units. So to be competitive in the process. So if you want to do a 20-unit project, it's probably not going to be competitive. If you're doing like 50 to 60 to 70, you're getting more into the competitive range. So it's less about the density overall and more about just the overall number of people you're serving.
I'm curious, has there been much talk about bringing back bungalow courts?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was the?
Bring up bungalow courts, so something that was pretty standard in like Los Angeles. I think that goes into the typology of the missing middle housing. I think that's a great idea. And if they're done from a design perspective really well, I think they fit it really nicely into neighborhoods. And they're really affordable to build compared to these other more dense products. So yes, I would say that there is talk about that.
Okay.
But you have to zone for it, right? And you have to find a place where that's, do you want bungalow courts right next to your train station? You probably want to be more dense than that. So where do we allow that?
And on our last online question, is how realistic are lower impact fees as an incentive when many impact fees are outside of communities' control, such as regional sanitation, school fees, Caltrans, you kind of mentioned this.
Yeah.
And maybe subject to Prop 2.
So again, really good point. Cities don't have control over all they charge, and so I fully recognize that. But to the extent that cities do have the authority to change the fees that they do have on their books, I think it makes a significant impact. Again, it's not a total game changer, right? If your project is well below that 6% or whatever the metric is in your community, reducing fees will get you part of the way there, but it's not going to be a silver bullet. I really want to emphasize that what the things I laid out here are not just let's take piecemeal one or two of these things. I think you need to think comprehensively about the areas you want to catalyze and think about doing some planning work around that looks at the fee structure, that looks at the approval times, that looks at the density, so that it's really a package that gives a developer certainty about what they can and cannot do in this space. And then thankfully there is a lot of money being made available at the state level from SB2. The governor's budget wants to basically double that for planning work. And we've seen many places where the upfront planning work makes a big difference in jump-starting markets. So,
Great.
I'll answer that.
Okay, any final words, questions? You have something? Nothing? All right, well, why don't we thank David for his time?
Sticking around, anyone else has any other questions, I'll be here for a little bit.
So we'll post this recording on the SACOG website sometime next week. Don't forget our next session, we talked a lot about the missing middle. We're gonna have Daniel Perlek, who coined that phrase, also from Berkeley.
Tell him I said
Something
hi.
in the water about Berkeley. So he's gonna be here in
Don't drink the Berkeley water.
September 19th. For those of you, we'll send out a notice about online how to get on.